Robert Martinez had been looking forward to this day for months. After 30 years of military service, he and his wife Elena were finally moving into their dream home. The house sat on a quiet street in Willows Creek, a neighborhood where every lawn looked perfect and every mailbox matched. It was the kind of place Robert had imagined coming home to during those long nights overseas. The moving truck pulled away just as the sun was setting. Robert stood in his new driveway looking at the boxes stacked in his garage. Tomorrow would bring the real work, but tonight he just wanted to enjoy the moment. Elena came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one. "It's beautiful here," she said, looking around at the tree-lined street. "So peaceful." Robert nodded. Peace was something he'd been searching for since he retired from the army 6 months ago. The nightmares still came sometimes, memories of places far from home where peace was just a word people used. But here, in this quiet neighborhood, maybe he could finally find it. The next morning, Robert was up early. Old habits die hard, and 28 years as a soldier had trained his body to wake before dawn. He made coffee and walked outside to check his new property. The house came with a small front yard and a perfect spot near the sidewalk where he planned to put his flagpole. He'd carried that flagpole with him through 3 different homes over the years. It wasn't fancy, just a simple white pole with a pulley system at the top. But it meant everything to him. Every morning since he was a young lieutenant, Robert had raised the American flag. It was his way of remembering why he served and honoring the friends who never made it home. By noon, he had the flagpole installed. It stood straight and proud in his front yard, ready for tomorrow's morning ceremony. Elena watched from the window as he worked, knowing how important this ritual was to her husband. She'd seen him struggle with the adjustment to civilian life, and if raising the flag each day helped him find peace, she would support it completely. The first neighbors to introduce themselves were Tom and Betty Williams, a retired couple from the house next door. They brought over a plate of cookies and seemed genuinely happy to welcome new people to the street. "Been in the military?" Tom asked, noticing Robert's straight posture and the way he carried himself. "Yes, sir. Retired Army," Robert replied simply. He never felt the need to mention his rank or decorations. Those things were in the past. "Thank you for your service," Betty said warmly. "Our son was in the Marines. We know how hard it can be." Over the next few days, more neighbors stopped by. Most were friendly enough, though Robert noticed they all seemed very concerned about keeping their properties looking just right. The grass was cut to exact heights, the flower beds were perfectly maintained, and not a single house had so much as a loose shutter. It was Mrs. Peterson from across the street who first mentioned the Homeowners Association. She was a kind woman, in her 70s, who brought over a casserole on their 3rd day. "Just wanted to let you know we have an active HOA here," she said, almost apologetically. "They can be pretty strict about things. You might want to check the rules about that flagpole." Robert thanked her for the information but didn't think much of it. He'd lived in neighborhoods with homeowner associations before. Most were reasonable. About flag displays, especially when they understood the person flying, it had served in the military. The flag went up every morning at sunrise. Robert would step outside in his robe and slippers, attach the flag to the rope and slowly raise it to the top of the pole. Then he would stand at attention for a moment, sometimes saying a quiet prayer for friends who were no longer with him. It was a simple ceremony that took less than 5 minutes, but it started every day with purpose and meaning. Some neighbors would wave as they left for work, seeing him in his front yard. A few even thanked him for displaying the flag so proudly. Robert began to think he'd found the perfect place to spend his retirement years. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail. The return address showed it was from the Willows Creek Homeowners Association, and the official-looking envelope made Robert's stomach tighten. Inside was a formal violation notice, typed on official letterhead and signed by someone named Karen Whitfield, board president. The letter stated that flagpoles required pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee before installation. Since Robert had not submitted the proper paperwork, he was in violation of the community guidelines. He had 72 hours to remove the flagpole or face daily fines starting at $50 per day. Robert read the letter twice, then called Elena over to read it as well. She frowned as she scanned the formal language and threats of legal action. "They can't be serious," she said. "It's the American flag. You're a veteran." Robert wasn't so sure. He'd seen enough bureaucracy in his military career to know that sometimes rules mattered more to people than common sense. But he also knew his rights. The Freedom to Display the American Flag Act was federal law, designed to protect exactly this kind of situation. That evening, Robert walked around the neighborhood, really looking at it for the first time since moving in. Every house was perfectly maintained, but something felt different now. The uniformity that had seemed charming before now felt oppressive. Not a single other house displayed an American flag. Not one. He stopped in front of his own house and looked at his flagpole. The flag hung still in the evening air, red, white, and blue against the darkening sky. This flag had flown over forward operating bases in Iraq and Afghanistan. It had been with him through promotions and deployals, through the loss of good soldiers and the joy of successful missions. It represented everything he'd fought for and believed in. Robert made his decision that night. The flagpole would stay. Some things were worth fighting for, even in retirement, especially in retirement. He'd spent his career defending the Constitution and the freedoms it guaranteed. He wasn't about to stop now because a homeowners association didn't like the way his flagpole looked. The next morning, the flag went up as usual. Robert stood at attention in his front yard, watching Old Glory catch the morning breeze. Across the street, he noticed a curtain move in Mrs. Peterson's window. Down the block, Tom Williams was getting his newspaper and gave a small wave. Robert waved back, then headed inside to write his response to the homeowners association. It would be respectful, but firm. He had every right to display the American flag, and no amount of bureaucratic pressure was going to change his mind. What Robert didn't know was that Karen Whitfield had already made up her mind as well. The new neighbor was going to learn that nobody ignored the rules in Willows Creek. Nobody. Robert spent 3 days crafting his response to the homeowners association. He wasn't a lawyer, but 30 years in the military had taught him how to write official correspondence. His letter was polite but clear. He had the legal right to display the American flag, and he would continue to do so. He dropped the letter in the mail on Friday morning, then raised his flag as usual. The morning ritual had become even more important to him now. It wasn't just about honoring his service anymore. It was about standing up for principles that mattered. Elena watched him from the kitchen window as he stood at attention in front of the flagpole. She knew her husband well enough to see the tension in his shoulders. The stress was getting to him, even though he tried to hide it. Sleep had been harder for him lately. The old nightmares were coming back more often. "Maybe we should just move the flagpole to the backyard," she suggested over breakfast. "We could still see it from the house." Robert shook his head. "That's not the point. The flag belongs where everyone can see it. That's what it's for." By Monday morning, Karen Whitfield had received Robert's letter. She read it twice, her face getting redder with each word. Nobody had ever challenged her authority like this before. As president of the Willows Creek HOA board for 6 years, she'd built her reputation on maintaining order and property values. This new neighbor was threatening everything she'd worked for. She called an emergency board meeting for that evening. The 5 board members gathered in the community center, a small building at the entrance to the neighborhood. Karen had prepared a thick folder of documents and legal precedents. "This Martinez situation is getting out of hand," she announced. "If we let one person ignore our rules, others will follow. Property values will drop, and this neighborhood will turn into chaos." Board member David Chen, a local accountant, raised his hand. "What exactly does the law say about flag displays? I mean, he seems to think he has legal grounds." Karen waved dismissively. "There are ways around those laws. Our community guidelines were legally approved. Everyone who bought a house here agreed to follow them. That includes Mr. Martinez." The discussion went on for 2 hours. Some board members had concerns about the legal implications, but Karen was determined. By the end of the meeting, they'd voted to escalate the matter. Daily fines would begin immediately, and if Robert continued to ignore them, they would place a lien on his property. The next morning brought another certified letter. This one was from the HOA's legal team, a law firm that specialized in community association matters. The language was much harsher than the first letter. Robert was now officially in violation and would be fined $50 per day until the flagpole was removed. After 30 days, the association would begin legal proceedings to place a lien on his property. Robert read the letter at his kitchen table while Elena made coffee. His hands were steady, but she could see the anger in his eyes. It was the same look he'd had when he came home from his last deployment, when he talked about the bureaucrats who made decisions without understanding what was really at stake. "They're serious about this," Elena said softly. "So am I," Robert replied. Word about the dispute began to spread through the neighborhood. Mrs. Peterson stopped by that afternoon with another casserole and a worried expression. "I heard about the letters," she said quietly. "I think what you're doing is wonderful, but Karen can be very determined when she sets her mind to something." Other neighbors had different reactions. The Williamses next door expressed their support, privately, but Tom mentioned that several people on the street were concerned about property values. A few houses down, the Johnsons had stopped waving when they saw Robert in his yard. The neighborhood was starting to divide. Some people saw Robert as a patriotic veteran standing up for his rights. Others saw him as a troublemaker who was putting their investment at risk. The morning flag ceremony that had once been a private moment of reflection was now the center of community controversy. Karen wasn't content to wait for the legal process to play out. She began walking through the neighborhood, in the evenings, talking to residents and building support for her position. She painted Robert as a rebel who thought he was above the rules that everyone else followed. "We all have to make sacrifices to live in a community like this," she told the Hendersons during one of these visits. "If we let him get away with this, what's next? Basketball hoops in front yards, boats parked in driveways. The whole character of our neighborhood could change." Meanwhile, Robert continued his morning routine, up before dawn, coffee on the porch, flag raised at sunrise. But now he noticed the way some neighbors looked at him. Conversations stopped when he walked by. Curtains moved in windows as people watched his daily ceremony. The stress was taking its toll on both Robert and Elena. She found him sitting in his study late one night looking at old military photographs. Pictures of young soldiers who'd served under his command, many of whom had been killed in action overseas. "Maybe we should sell the house," she said gently. "Find somewhere more peaceful." Robert looked up at her with tired eyes. "I've run from enough fights in my life. I'm not running from this one." The daily fines continued to accumulate. $50 a day, every day, documented in formal letters that arrived with clockwork precision. After 2 weeks, Robert owed $700 and the amount was climbing fast. The final straw came during the monthly HOA meeting. Karen had scheduled it for a Thursday evening and made sure word got out that the flag situation would be discussed. The community center was packed with nearly 50 residents, more than had attended any meeting in years. Robert decided to attend. He put on his best shirt and tie, the same outfit he'd worn to retirement ceremonies and military funerals. Elena wanted to come with him, but he insisted on going alone. The meeting started with routine business, but everyone was waiting for the main event. When Karen finally brought up the ongoing violation at 247 Oak Street, the room went silent. "Mr. Martinez has shown complete disregard for our community standards," Karen announced. "His continued violation threatens the stability and property values of our entire neighborhood." Robert stood up slowly. The room turned to look at him, this quiet man who'd caused such a stir. When he spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "Ma'am, I've read your letters and I understand your position, but I believe displaying the American flag is not just my right, it's my duty. I've spent 30 years defending that flag and what it represents. I'm not going to stop now because it doesn't match your idea of what the neighborhood should look like." The room erupted in murmurs and whispered conversations. Karen's face flushed red as she pounded her gavel for order. "Mr. Martinez, you agreed to follow our rules when you bought your house. No one is above those rules regardless of their background." Robert remained standing. "Ma'am, with all due respect, some things are more important than rules. The Constitution and the freedoms it protects are more important than your homeowners association guidelines." Karen stood up, her voice rising. If you continue this defiance, we will use every legal tool at our disposal. We will put a lien on your property. We will take you to court, and if necessary, we will call law enforcement to deal with this situation. The room went completely quiet. Robert looked directly at Karen, his military bearing evident in his straight posture and steady gaze. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you do what you feel you need to do." As Robert walked out of that meeting, he knew the battle lines had been drawn. Karen had made her threats and everyone in the neighborhood had heard them. Tomorrow morning he would raise his flag again, just like he had every day for the past month. And he would keep raising it, no matter what it cost him. What he didn't know was that Karen was already planning her next move. She had a phone number written on a piece of paper in her purse, the number for the local police department. 3 days after the heated HOA meeting, Karen Whitfield sat in her home office staring at her phone. The piece of paper with the police department's number lay on her desk, wrinkled from being folded and unfolded so many times. She'd been thinking about this decision since Thursday night, and her anger had only grown stronger. Outside her window, she could see Robert's flagpole in the distance. Every morning for the past month, she'd watched him perform his little ceremony. It drove her crazy. Here was a man who thought he could ignore the rules that everyone else followed. If she let this slide, what would stop other residents from doing whatever they wanted? Karen had built her reputation in this neighborhood on maintaining order. As a successful real estate agent, she knew how quickly property values could drop when communities lost their standards. She'd worked too hard to let one stubborn veteran destroy everything she'd accomplished. On Tuesday morning, she made the call. "Willows Creek Police Department, how can I help you?" Karen took a deep breath. "I need to report a domestic disturbance in my neighborhood. We have a resident who's being very aggressive and refusing to follow community rules. He's causing problems with other neighbors, and I'm concerned about the situation escalating." The dispatcher asked for details. Karen carefully explained that Robert Martinez had been violating HOA rules for weeks, accumulating thousands of dollars in fines, and had become confrontational at community meetings. She mentioned that he'd been in the military and seemed to have anger issues. "Has he threatened anyone directly?" the dispatcher asked. Karen hesitated. "Not exactly, but his behavior has been very intimidating. He told our board that we could do what we feel we need to do when we warned him about legal consequences. Some neighbors are afraid of how he might react if we continue enforcing our rules." The dispatcher said they'd send someone out to check on the situation. Karen hung up the phone feeling justified. She was protecting her community from a troublemaker who refused to follow the rules. Meanwhile, Robert was completely unaware of what was coming. That Tuesday morning started like any other. He woke up before sunrise, made his coffee, and stepped outside to raise the flag. The spring air was cool and fresh, and for a moment he felt the peace he'd been searching for since retirement. After his morning ceremony, Robert spent the day working in his garden. Elena had gone to visit her sister for the week, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his plants. Gardening had become his new therapy. There was something healing about working with his hands, watching things grow, creating beauty from dirt and seeds. He was kneeling among his tomato plants around 10 o'clock when he heard car doors slamming in his driveway. Looking up, he saw 2 police officers walking toward his front door. His heart started beating faster, not from fear, but from confusion. In all his years as a law-abiding citizen, he'd never had police come to his home. Officer Mike Torres, a 10-year veteran of the force, knocked on Robert's front door while his partner, Officer Lisa Chang, stood nearby. They'd been briefed about a possible domestic disturbance, but the quiet suburban street didn't look like the scene of any trouble. Robert answered the door, still wearing his gardening gloves, dirt on his knees, and a puzzled expression on his face. "Good morning, sir. I'm Officer Torres. This is Officer Chang. We received a call about some kind of disturbance at this address. Mind if we come in and talk for a few minutes?" Robert's military training kicked in immediately. Respect for law enforcement was deeply ingrained in him. "Of course, officers, please come in. Can I get you some coffee?" The 3 of them sat in Robert's living room, where the morning sun streamed through clean windows onto comfortable furniture. Officer Torres looked around the neat, peaceful home and wondered what kind of disturbance could possibly be happening here. "Sir, we got a call from someone in your neighborhood saying there's been some kind of ongoing conflict. They mentioned you've been having problems with your homeowners association?" Robert nodded slowly. "Yes, there's been a disagreement about my flagpole. The HOA wants me to take it down, but I believe I have the right to display the American flag." "Officer," Chang looked out the window at the flagpole in question. "That's what this is about, your flag?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm a retired Army officer, and I've been raising that flag every morning for 30 years. It's important to me." Officer Torres noticed something on Robert's coffee table that made him look twice. Among the magazines and coasters were several military challenge coins, the kind that units give to recognize exceptional service. One was from the 82nd Airborne Division, another from a Special Forces unit. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what was your rank when you retired?" Robert seemed uncomfortable talking about his service, but he answered politely. "I was a colonel, served 28 years active duty." Both officers' attitudes shifted immediately. Officer Torres had served in the Army National Guard before becoming a police officer. He knew what it took to reach the rank of colonel, especially in today's military with multiple deployments and constant operations overseas. "Where did you serve, sir?" Torres asked with genuine respect. "Iraq and Afghanistan mostly. A few other places over the years." Robert's humble way of describing his service only impressed the officers more. Most people who'd seen combat in those wars had stories to tell, but Robert clearly wasn't the type to brag about his experiences. Officer Chang asked the obvious question. "So someone called the police because you won't take down your American flag?" "That's about the size of it," Robert said with a slight smile. "I know it sounds silly, but some things are worth standing up for." The officers exchanged glances. They'd been expecting to find an angry resident causing problems in the neighborhood. Instead, they'd found a polite, respectful veteran who was quietly defending his right to honor his country and his fallen comrades. Officer Torres stood up and walked to the window. He could see the flagpole clearly, with Old Glory hanging peacefully in the morning breeze. Around the neighborhood, he noticed perfectly manicured lawns and matching mailboxes, the kind of place where people worried more about property values than principles. "Colonel Martinez," he said, turning back to Robert, "I want you to know that someone used emergency services to file a false complaint about you. Calling 911 should be reserved for real emergencies, not HOA disputes." Robert's expression darkened slightly. "They called this in as an emergency?" "Yes, sir, they did. And in my opinion, that's a misuse of police resources." Officer Chang added, "We're going to file a report about this incident, and it's not going to reflect well on whoever made the call. Meanwhile, you keep flying that flag, Colonel. You've earned that right." After the officers left, Robert sat in his living room thinking about what had just happened. Someone in his neighborhood had been so angry about his flagpole that they'd called the police and lied about the situation. The thought made him both sad and angry. He walked outside and looked at his flag, now fluttering in a stronger afternoon breeze. This piece of cloth represented everything he'd fought for during his military career. Freedom, justice, the right to live according to your principles. Now he was fighting for those same things in his own neighborhood. Robert made a decision that afternoon. He wasn't just going to keep flying his flag. He was going to make sure everyone knew why it mattered. The people who'd called the police on him clearly didn't understand what that flag meant to the men and women who'd served under it overseas. That evening, he called Elena and told her what had happened. She was furious that someone had involved the police in their petty neighborhood dispute. "I'm coming home tomorrow," she said. "This has gone too far." "No," Robert replied. "Stay with your sister. I need to handle this my way." As the sun set that Tuesday evening, Robert stood in his front yard looking at his flag one more time before lowering it for the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he was ready for them. He'd faced worse enemies than a power-hungry HOA president, and he'd survived. This fight was just getting started. What Robert didn't know was that Officer Torres had gone back to the station and started asking questions about his military record. What he would discover would change everything and turn Robert from a neighborhood troublemaker into a local hero. But that was still to come. Officer Mike Torres couldn't stop thinking about his visit to Robert Martinez's house. Something about the quiet dignity of the retired colonel had stayed with him all day. That evening, after his shift ended, he sat in his patrol car outside the police station, thinking about the challenge coins he'd seen on Robert's coffee table. Torres had served 6 years in the Army National Guard before becoming a police officer. He knew military culture well enough to recognize that those coins weren't just decorations. They were earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. The fact that Robert had them but never mentioned what he'd done to earn them made Torres even more curious. The next morning, Torres decided to do some research. He had a friend who worked in the Veterans Affairs office who might be able to help him understand more about Robert's service record. Not to violate anyone's privacy, but just to get a sense of what kind of soldier Robert had been. His friend, Kevin Walsh, was a former Marine who now helped veterans navigate their benefits. When Torres called and explained the situation, Kevin was immediately interested. "You said his name was Robert Martinez, retired colonel?" Kevin asked. "Let me check some public records. If he received any major awards, they might be listed in official databases." An hour later, Kevin called back. His voice was different, more serious. "Mike, you need to sit down for this. Your neighbor isn't just any retired colonel. Robert Martinez is a genuine war hero. I'm looking at citations for a Bronze Star with Valor, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Legion of Merit. This guy saw some serious combat." Torres felt his stomach drop. "What kind of combat?" "Multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, led special operations missions, saved countless lives. There's a citation here about him personally carrying wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. Mike, this man is the real deal." Torres hung up the phone and sat in silence for several minutes. A decorated war hero was being harassed by his own neighbors for flying the American flag. The irony was almost too much to bear. Meanwhile, word was spreading through the Willows Creek Police Department about the false emergency call. Chief Patricia Barnes was not happy. She'd been running the department for 15 years and had zero tolerance for people who wasted police resources on personal disputes. "Someone called 911 and lied about a domestic disturbance to get us to harass a veteran?" she asked Torres during their morning briefing. "That's not just wrong, it's potentially illegal." Torres nodded. "Chief, I think you should know what kind of veteran we're talking about here." He shared what Kevin had told him about Robert's service record. Chief Barnes's expression grew more serious with each detail. Bronze Star with Valor, 2 Purple Hearts, and someone called him a troublemaker? "Yes, ma'am. He was nothing but polite and respectful when we visited, offered us coffee, answered all our questions honestly. He's just trying to fly the American flag in his own front yard." Chief Barnes made a decision that would change everything. "I want you to pay Colonel Martinez another visit. This time, thank him properly for his service. And I want to know who made that false report." While the police were learning the truth about Robert, the story was about to break in a much bigger way. Amy Rodriguez, a reporter for the local newspaper, had been tipped off about the incident by someone at the police station. When she started digging into the story, she couldn't believe what she was finding. Amy had covered military stories before, but Robert's record was extraordinary. She found news articles from his deployments, mentions in military publications, and testimonials from soldiers who had served under his command. The more she researched, the more amazed she became. She decided to drive to Willows Creek to see the famous flagpole for herself. The neighborhood was exactly what she'd expected: perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, and an obvious emphasis on conformity. Robert's modest flagpole looked completely normal, certainly nothing that should cause such controversy. Amy knocked on Robert's door that afternoon. He answered wearing work clothes, having spent the day fixing a fence in his backyard. When she explained that she was a reporter looking into his situation, Robert's first instinct was to decline the interview. "I'm not looking for attention," he said politely. "I just want to fly my flag in peace." "Colonel Martinez, I think people need to know what kind of person is being targeted here. Your neighbors are calling the police on a Bronze Star recipient for displaying the American flag. That's a story people need to hear." Robert was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he invited her in. Over the next hour, Amy learned things about Robert that even his closest neighbors didn't know. He'd served 4 combat deployments, led dangerous missions behind enemy lines, and been wounded twice while saving other soldiers. But what impressed her most was his humility. "I didn't do anything special," Robert insisted. "I just did my job, same as thousands of other soldiers." Amy disagreed. "Colonel, you were awarded the Bronze Star for personally rescuing 3 wounded soldiers under heavy enemy fire. That's not just doing your job, that's being a hero." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home. I fly that flag for them as much as for anything else." That evening, Amy's story hit the newspaper's website. Within hours, it was being shared across social media. The headline read, "HOA calls police on decorated war hero for flying American flag." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Veterans from across the county started calling the newspaper, expressing outrage that a fellow veteran was being treated this way. Local businesses offered their support. Social media exploded with messages of solidarity. Elena Martinez was visiting her sister 2 hours away when she started getting phone calls from friends who had seen the story online. She immediately drove home, arriving just as the evening news van was pulling up to their house. "Robert, what's happening?" she asked, seeing the crowd of reporters and neighbors gathered in their front yard. Robert looked overwhelmed. "The story got out. Now everyone knows." That night, the local news ran a feature story about Robert's situation. They interviewed veterans, who praised his service, showed footage of his modest flagpole, and explained the legal protections for flag displays. The contrast between Robert's heroic military record and the petty HOA complaint was stark. The story went viral overnight. By morning, news outlets from across the state were calling for interviews. Veterans organizations were issuing statements of support. The American Legion Post in the next town announced they were planning a solidarity event. Karen Whitfield woke up to find her phone ringing nonstop. Friends, neighbors, and complete strangers were calling to express their disgust with her actions. Her real estate business was getting negative reviews online. The local veterans group had posted her name and photo on their Facebook page, asking people to boycott her services. She tried calling other HOA board members for support, but found that several were distancing themselves from the situation. David Chen, the accountant, was particularly blunt. "Karen, I never signed up to harass war heroes. This has gotten completely out of hand." By the weekend, the story had reached national attention. Cable news shows were discussing the case, using it as an example of bureaucratic overreach and disrespect for veterans. Robert's quiet dignity in interviews contrasted sharply with Karen's refusal to comment publicly. On Sunday morning, Robert performed his usual flag ceremony, but this time he wasn't alone. Nearly 50 people had gathered in his front yard, including veterans from 3 different wars, active duty service members, and neighbors who had never spoken to him before. As Robert raised the flag, the crowd stood at attention. Several veterans saluted. Mrs. Peterson from across the street was crying. Even Tom Williams, who had been worried about property values, was there with his hand over his heart. When the flag reached the top of the pole, spontaneous applause broke out. Robert stood quietly, overwhelmed by the support but still uncomfortable with being the center of attention. An elderly veteran approached him after the ceremony. "Colonel, I served in Vietnam. I know what it's like to come home and not be appreciated. Today, we're making sure that doesn't happen to you." Robert shook the man's hand, finally understanding that this fight had become about much more than just his flagpole. It was about respect for service, the meaning of patriotism, and the rights that he and millions of others had fought to protect. The truth was finally out, and there was no going back. The week following the viral news story changed everything in Willows Creek. What had started as a simple dispute between a veteran and his HOA had grown into something much bigger. Veterans from across the state were making pilgrimages to Robert's house, wanting to shake hands with the decorated colonel who had stood up for their shared values. On Monday morning, Robert stepped outside for his usual flag ceremony to find 23 veterans waiting in his front yard. They had driven from different cities, some traveling over 100 miles just to be part of his morning ritual. Among them was Frank Rivera, a Vietnam veteran who had lost his leg in combat 50 years earlier. "Colonel, we heard what you've Been going through, Frank said, leaning on his walking cane. We wanted you to know that you're not fighting this battle alone. As Robert raised the flag that morning, the group of veterans stood at attention in his front yard. Some saluted, others simply placed their hands over their hearts. When the flag reached the top of the pole, several of them began reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the group. Elena watched from the kitchen window, finally understanding the full impact of what her husband had started. This wasn't just about their flagpole anymore. Robert had become a symbol for veterans everywhere who felt forgotten or disrespected. The support continued throughout the week. Local businesses started putting up signs supporting Robert. The hardware store downtown displayed a banner reading, "We support our veterans." The diner on Main Street offered free meals to any veteran who showed up in uniform. Even the high school students organized a fundraiser to help Robert pay the accumulated HOA fines. Meanwhile, Karen Whitfield was facing the consequences of her actions. Her real estate business had lost 3 major clients in 2 days. The local newspaper had published an editorial criticizing her treatment of a war hero. Even her own HOA board was turning against her. David Chen called an emergency board meeting for Wednesday evening. When Karen arrived at the community center, she found the other 4 board members waiting with serious expressions. "Karen, we need to talk about this situation," David began. "The negative publicity is affecting all of us. Property values are actually going down because people don't want to live in a neighborhood that treats veterans this way." Board member Jennifer Walsh, a retired teacher, was more direct. "What you did was wrong, Karen. Calling the police on a decorated war hero for flying the American flag? How did you think that was going to end?" Karen tried to defend her position. "I was protecting our community standards. Rules exist for a reason. Some things are more important than rules," replied Paul Thompson, another board member. "This man served our country with honor. The least we can do is let him fly the flag he fought for." By the end of the meeting, the board had voted unanimously to drop all fines against Robert and to formally apologize for the harassment he had endured. Karen was asked to resign as president, and when she refused, the board voted to remove her from office. The news of Karen's removal reached Robert that evening through a phone call from David Chen. The new board president was calling to personally apologize and to invite Robert to the next HOA meeting as a guest of honor. "Colonel Martinez, what happened to you was completely unacceptable. We want to make this right," David said. Robert was gracious in accepting the apology, but he made it clear that his fight had been about principles, not personal revenge. "I just wanted the right to honor my country and my fallen comrades. I'm glad we can put this behind us." The following Saturday, the city council held a special meeting that would change local law forever. Mayor Rebecca Johnson had been following Robert's story closely and decided that no veteran should ever face this kind of harassment again. "I'm proposing an emergency ordinance that will protect the rights of veterans to display the American flag, regardless of any HOA restrictions," she announced to a packed council chamber. The ordinance passed unanimously. It became known locally as the Martinez Rule, ensuring that no homeowners association in the city could prevent veterans from displaying the American flag on their property. Robert was invited to speak at the council meeting. Standing at the podium in his best suit, he looked out at the crowd of supporters, city officials, and local media. "When I raised that flag for the first time in my new home, I never imagined it would lead to all of this," he began. "I just wanted to honor the men and women I served with, especially those who never made it home. The flag represents the freedoms they died protecting, including the freedom to live according to your principles." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "I've learned something important through this experience. Sometimes standing up for what's right means standing alone, but I've also learned that you're never really alone when you're fighting for something that matters. The support I've received from this community, from veterans across the country, and from people who simply believe in doing what's right, has shown me the best of what America can be." The crowd gave him a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. 2 weeks later, Robert organized what he called a community flag day in his front yard. He invited everyone in the neighborhood to join him for a morning flag ceremony, followed by a barbecue where people could share stories about what the flag meant to them. Over 100 people showed up. Veterans brought their own flags to display. Families came with children who had never participated in a flag ceremony before. Even some of the neighbors who had initially supported the HOA's position came to pay their respects. Karen Whitfield surprised everyone by showing up near the end of the event. She approached Robert hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable but determined to speak with him. "Colonel Martinez, I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I was so focused on rules and property values that I forgot what really matters. I'm sorry for putting you through this ordeal." Robert extended his hand to her. "We all make mistakes. What matters is learning from them." Karen shook his hand, tears in her eyes. "I want you to know that I never understood what your service meant until all of this happened. Thank you for your sacrifice." As the sun began to set that evening, Robert stood in his front yard looking at his flagpole one more time. The controversy had died down, the media had moved on to other stories, and life in Willows Creek was returning to normal. But everything had changed. His morning flag ceremony was no longer a solitary ritual. Every day, at least a few neighbors joined him. Children walking to school would stop and put their hands over their hearts. The mailman often timed his route to be there for the ceremony. Elena joined him in the yard as he prepared to lower the flag for the evening. "Any regrets?" she asked. Robert thought for a moment, watching the flag flutter in the evening breeze. "Only that it took so long for people to understand why this matters. And now they do?" "Now they do," he said, carefully lowering the flag and folding it with the precision he'd learned decades ago in the Army. As they walked back toward their house, Robert noticed Mrs. Peterson hanging a small American flag by her front door. Donnie. The street. The Williamses had installed their own flagpole. The Johnsons, who had once complained about Robert's flag, now had flag stickers on their car windows. The neighborhood had learned something important about patriotism, respect, and the true meaning of community. Sometimes it takes one person, willing to stand up for what's right, to remind everyone else of what really matters. Robert Martinez had just wanted to fly his flag in peace. Instead, he had reminded an entire community about the values that flag represents. As he turned off his porch light that night, he knew that tomorrow would bring another morning ceremony, another chance to honor those who had served, and another day in the country he had spent his life defending. The flag would fly on,